the truth is that it's genocide, James Paterson, why don't we call it that?
Well, Hamish, I was banned from visiting China in part because I've been outspoken about these issues.
So do you call it genocide?
I think it's very hard to look at Vicky's research and the research for former colleagues at ASPI or Human Rights Watch or any of these other groups that have done it and conclude anything else. The reason why the Australian government hasn't declared it is not because of some judgment about trade or economics. It's because the Australian government has a long-standing policy that a genocide declaration is a legal declaration and a court should do that, not governments and not politicians. But I'm happy to say it sure looks like it to me.
So why is it hard for our foreign minister to say that, though?
Well, to be fair, our Foreign Minister's been one of the most outspoken foreign ministers internationally on these issues, and she's called for the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to have access to Xinjiang so that they can collect evidence to help make this determination. And the Chinese government's unwillingness to allow them in speaks volumes, as does, frankly, the campaign of harassment they've launched against Vicky and her colleagues internationally. Why on earth would you do that if you didn't have something to hide?
And Tony Tan, you're an entrepreneur, I think. What do you do? What do you make?
We're in sustainability products with silicone.
And what are you working on at the moment?
So my company, Silfresh, has a very exciting partnership with the CSIRO. And basically, we've created a technology-based paint that is anti-pathogenic and kills viruses like COVID-19. But we've really struggled, I guess, to get it out there.
And so in terms of funding and what you get offered here, how does that compare with what you are offered to go and do all of this in China?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're a great example of how Australia has really failed in bringing up innovative companies like myself. If we look at the Chinese government, in the West, we always talk about how China is stealing our jobs, how China is stealing our IP, stealing our technology. But you know what? No one is talking about how China is, genuinely and honestly, encouraging the transfer of IP from places like Australia to China.
So how are they doing that? How are they inducing you to take your IP to China?
Yeah. So they're actually doing it through R&D grant programs as well as through investors that they support. And the example of us really is them. We've gotten offers from the Chinese city government to of over $100,000 to take our National Science Agency technology over to China and commercialise it, whilst I can't even get $10,000 from the ATO cash flow boost here. So you can see how there is complete, discord between what China is offering companies like mine and what the Australian government and the Australian ecosystem is.
Senator Paterson?
Well, the reason why we talk about the Chinese government stealing our intellectual property is because they do. They do it through a range of different means. They do it through cyber espionage. They do it through cultivating researchers individually. They do it through literally registering patents of intellectual property that was funded by Australian taxpayers through the Australian Research Council. And the conditions of the grant of the ARC are that you can't register your intellectual property anywhere else. So they do steal our intellectual property. They've been doing it for decades.
But you're not saying they are in this instance?
Well, I don't know about that instance. I can't comment on that. But to your broader point, yes, we absolutely have to do more to encourage self-reliance and self-sufficiency in Australia. That's one of the lessons of the pandemic, and it's one of the lessons of the campaign of economic coercion that China is waging against us right now.
Let's just be straight, because I just want to deal with Tony's point here.
Yep.
Is this an example of economic coercion? I mean, what's wrong with what's going on?
Oh, I've got no idea about... I don't have anywhere near sufficient information to make that judgment. Not on the face of it of what you've told me. No, I'm not suggesting that.
And you don't have a problem with what's happening? I mean, presumably you would prefer this to be staying in Australia.
Yeah, an entrepreneur who receives an attractive offer from somewhere else in the world is absolutely entitled to take that up. I'll be the last person to tell you not to take that up. But as a country, we have to do better to make sure that we can produce more of these technologies here in Australia. And what I was going to say, the campaign of economic coercion has taught us is that before this all hit, when I went to talk to business leaders about this, and I said maybe diversification is a bit of a good idea, they thought that was a very strange proposition. Now they come to me and say, we need to do a bit more to diversify our trade. And that's a really positive development.
But there is a double standard here. That
I just want to bring Senator Paterson in on that. Why isn't there Pfizer available for a young healthcare worker now?
Well, there will be very soon, but like everyone else in the world, we're scrambling to get as much vaccines as we can. There's only about 10 countries in the world that have sovereign manufacturing capability for vaccines. We're one of them, and so far we've been producing AstraZeneca domestically. We haven't been producing Pfizer domestically, although that's a possibility down the track. So every other country in the world, the 180 other countries in the world, are just trying to get as much vaccine as they can, and they're reliant on imports.
Can I just pick up on that? Are you saying that we should be manufacturing the mRNA vaccines here?
I'm saying it should be looked at, and it will be looked at, and if it's possible, I'm sure we'll do it. At the moment, the capacity
Why isn't
that we've
it
got,
already being looked at?
Well, these things are being examined on a daily, hourly basis, Hamish. At the moment, the capacity we've got with CSL in Melbourne is to produce AstraZeneca vaccine, but CSL has publicly said, in fact, before the COVID committee that Katie and I sit on, that they're open to seeing if they can manufacture other vaccines. There's different technologies involved, different capabilities involved. It's not a straightforward thing to do. We can't just flick a switch, but it is possible.
It takes
the
about a
facts
year,
are
doesn't it?
that Pfizer knocked on the door of the government last June, saying, what do you want? When do you want it? There was a meeting, and I'm not sure what happened at it, on the 10th of July, and a deal wasn't done until the end of November. What happened in those 4 or 5 months when Britain was doing deals with Pfizer, America was doing deals with Pfizer, and other countries were too? We didn't. And so we came to the party late when Pfizer had already committed its doses. So we could have had Pfizer, but we chose clearly not to.
Well, just in response to that, we already have some doses of Pfizer. They've already been administered to Australians, so it's inaccurate to say we don't have it.
But we're still giving it to
secured
aged care who don't need it. They could have Astra safely and be very effectively covered, and we're still going to aged care, and young healthcare workers. We're not saving every Pfizer dose for young healthcare workers at the moment.
We have secured 40 million doses of Pfizer, which will be available throughout this year. But it is understandable why other countries who have suffered much more widespread community transmission than us are prioritising vaccinating their own populations with vaccines like Pfizer rather than allowing them to be exported. I'm disappointed that the European Union has blocked exports of AstraZeneca, but as it turned out, it's the Pfizer vaccine which will be more useful for younger Australians, and they will be tended to be vaccinated much later than older Australians anyway. So,
but why
by
are
the
we
time
not?
Pfizer
Why are we
arrives,
not prioritising the Pfizer that we have here now for people like Jessica?
The people most at risk of dying from COVID are older Australians, and
Astra protects them really well.
If you let me finish, Norman, the Pfizer vaccine can be given to people 21 days apart, the first and second dose. The AstraZeneca vaccine has to be given to people 12 weeks apart. And so if you're an elderly person in a nursing home, we want to get you protected as soon as possible. So it is quicker to protect you with Pfizer than it is AstraZeneca, and that's the reason why it's still being deployed there.
Okay.
Hamish, Katie has admitted some other advice that the Labor Party has offered the government on vaccines, which we didn't take up, and it's a good thing we didn't follow their advice. In a radio interview last week and another one this week, Anthony Albanese said the Australian government should have bought the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and it was a disgrace that we hadn't done so. Well, actually, the expert medical advice we received at the time was that we shouldn't get it because it was very similar to the AstraZeneca vaccine, and not less than 24 hours after Anthony Albanese did that second interview, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in America was paused in its rollout because of blood clots. There is a real danger in following politicians' advice and commentators' advice and ignoring the expert medical advice. What we did about a year ago, when we didn't even know whether vaccines would be able to be produced successfully, let alone 3 or 4 of them, was bet on a range of different vaccines with a range of different technologies. Traditional technologies like AstraZeneca, new technologies like Pfizer,
Can we just be
protein-based
clear
vaccines.
and honest about this? It's not going well currently.
No.
Is it?
It's not.
Hamish, we're in a global pandemic, right? So we're going to encounter some challenges.
Sure.
And actually, I think if you look at the health outcomes in Australia or the economic outcomes that Katty's mentioned, we are leading the world. We've had some of the fewest infections, the fewest deaths, the best economic recovery.
That's incontrovertible. However,
thank you.
Another.
With the information that tens of millions of dollars were paid in bonuses to Australian public servants during the same period the Australian Post team received their watches, why can't Scott Morrison just man up and apologise to Christine Holgate? He would gain more respect if he did.
Senator Paterson.
I've got a lot of empathy for Christine Holgate because going through what she went through, being in the eye of a media storm, is a horrible thing to experience. And I have a bit of a different perspective to you, though, on the Prime Minister's involvement, because 4 years ago I was the parliamentary committee chair that revealed her predecessor as Australia Post CEO, Ahmed Fahour's salary. It was a pretty horrible time for him too. And I did so because I thought it was an important principle of transparency, that taxpayers are entitled to know what the senior executives at a public entity are paid. He was on the front page of newspapers, and it ultimately led to his early retirement from that role. Now, at the time, no one said it was a gendered criticism because he was a man, and I don't remember anyone saying it was bullying either. They just thought it was appropriate scrutiny for a public servant, effectively. And I think the same is the case for Christine Holgate. I think it was inappropriate expenditure of taxpayers' money to hand out luxury watches to already very well-paid people. And I was also concerned to hear Christine Holgate say before the Senate committee that she wasn't spending taxpayers' money. Australia Post was established by taxpayers, it has been legislated by taxpayers, it is owned by taxpayers, and every dollar of profit that it earns is remitted to taxpayers. So if they're spending it on luxury watches, that's money that doesn't go to taxpayers. And 4 years into her reign as CEO, that she didn't understand what comes with running a public entity was of concern to me.
But let's just be clear, she's not asking for an apology because of the scrutiny, she's asking for an apology because of the way the Prime Minister treated her on the floor of the Parliament. That's a very different thing.
Well, I don't actually think it is that different, Hamish. I think the Prime Minister was reflecting the frustration that a lot of Australians would hear when they heard that already very highly paid public servants were further awarding themselves with taxpayers' money with expensive watches that most Australian taxpayers would never be able to afford to buy themselves. If you make decisions like that...
So it's okay in that circumstance to stand up in the Parliament and do what he did?
Well, what he did was stand up in the Parliament and say there will be an investigation, and that if Ms Holgate didn't want to stand aside while that investigation took place, she should go. Now, she did stand aside. That was the appropriate thing to do.
It was pretty aggressive. You acknowledge that.
It was very strong, and I think it reflected the sentiment at the time. It reflected the tone of the questions asked by Labor senators in estimates, which revealed this expenditure. It reflected the tone of the question that Anthony Albanese asked as opposition leader to the Prime Minister in question time, and indeed Mr Albanese's statement that Christine Holgate's position was untenable before she decided to resign.
So no.